Fall of 1967, on a gravel road outside of Haskell, Texas, a 38-year-old woman named Loretta Gaines paid $11.40 for a rain gauge, a soil auger, and a second-hand copy of a Texas A&M Extension bulletin on groundwater depletion that nobody in Throckmorton County had asked for. The man at the farm supply in Stamford wrapped the gauge in newspaper and told her the auger bit was good for sandy loam but might bind in caliche. He did not ask what she was planning to do with it. Most people in Throckmorton County did not ask Loretta Gaines what she was planning because they had learned over the years that the answer was usually something they would have to think about longer than they wanted to. Her husband, Paul Gaines, had died in March of that year. Not dramatically, not in any of the ways that ranch country produces for its obituaries. No horse, no machinery, no flood. A heart attack at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning at 51 years old, with his coffee half finished and the radio on. He had been a good man and a decent rancher, and he had left Loretta with 960 acres in the rolling mesquite country east of Haskell, a herd of 140 Hereford cows, a banknote with 14 months left on it, and a water well that had been dropping 8 inches a year since 1958. The well was the problem, not the note, not the cattle, not the land. The well. Paul had known about it. He had talked to the driller in Abilene in 1963 and been told what every driller in that part of Texas was telling people in 1963, which was that the Ogallala was a big aquifer and the water was there and the pumps were good and a man did not need to worry about it in his lifetime. Paul had believed him because believing him was easier than not believing him and because there was no clear alternative on offer. He had run his cattle, watered them from the well, irrigated his small hayfield from the well, let the hired man wash the truck from the well, and tried not to think about the water table measurements that the county extension agent published every spring in the paper. The ones that showed the level dropping year by year, 2 inches, 3 inches, 6 inches, 8 inches, a slow and patient disaster unfolding on a schedule that did not match any one man's operating plan. Loretta had thought about it. She had thought about it since 1961, when she had read an article in a farm journal about ranchers in the Texas Panhandle who were drilling deeper and deeper and finding less and less. She had marked the article with a pencil and put it in the drawer next to the stove, and taken it out again several times over 6 years and put it back. She had mentioned it to Paul twice. He had listened carefully both times and said that they would deal with it when they had to deal with it. Paul was not a man who wasted worry on problems that had not arrived yet. In the spring of 1968, 6 months after she bought the rain gauge, Loretta Gaines began doing something that no one in Throckmorton County had seen a rancher do on purpose. She started building earthen tanks, not the kind of stock tank every ranch had, the shallow overflow ponds that collected runoff after a rain and went dry by July. Something different, larger, shaped to hold water longer, positioned at the low points of her pastures, where the runoff from the caliche ridges drained naturally after every storm. She hired a man with a blade to push the earthworks, and then she hired him again 2 months later, and again in the fall. Her nearest neighbor, a cotton farmer named Dewey Sutton, whose land ran along her east fence, stopped his truck on the county road one afternoon in October and watched her direct the blade operator from the bed of her pickup. He watched for a while and then drove on. The next week he stopped again, and this time he got out and walked to the fence. "Loretta," he said. "Dewey," she said. "What in the world are you building over there?" "Catchment basins." He looked at the raw dirt berms, the scraped channels, the wide shallow depressions that the blade had carved into the pasture floor. He was 55 years old and had farmed that county for 30 years. And he had never heard the words catchment basins used in a normal conversation. "What for?" "Rain." Dewey looked at the sky, which was the color of old denim and had not produced meaningful rain since April. He looked back at the basins. He was not a man who laughed at women, particularly women who had just lost their husbands and were running a cattle operation alone. But he stood at that fence for a long moment without speaking, which was its own kind of answer. He told his wife about it at supper. His wife told the woman at the beauty parlor in Haskell. The woman at the beauty parlor told 3 customers that week. By November, Throckmorton County had a new story, quieter than most, because Loretta Gaines was not the sort of person who gave people much to work with. The widow on the Gaines place is building dirt basins to catch rain, the story went. Like she's going to catch enough rain in West Texas to water a cattle herd. Something about the well. The well was known. People knew the well had been dropping. They also knew that the solution to a dropping well was to drill deeper, which is what 3 other ranchers in the county had done in the past 5 years, spending between $4,000 and $9,000 per drilling and getting anywhere from 8 to 20 more years out of their water, depending on whom you asked. The solution was not to build mud holes in your pasture and wait for rain. That was not a solution. That was something a person did when they had run out of real options. Let me tell you about Loretta Gaines, because what she built on those 960 acres over the next 12 years only makes sense if you understand who she was and how she had learned to see things. She was born in 1929 in Coleman County, the second of 4 children of a dry land farmer named August Prather, who had come to West Texas from Missouri in 1919 with a borrowed plow, a team of mules, and the conviction that the land would produce if a man understood it well enough. August Prather did not have much formal education. He had, instead, the particular kind of intelligence that belongs to people who watch carefully and remember everything. He kept notes, not a formal journal, just a ruled composition book he bought at the 5 and Dime in Coleman every January, where he wrote the date and the rainfall and the temperature and what the pasture looked like and where the water was standing and whether the grass was coming in strong or thin after a rain. He had 12 of these books by the time Loretta was old enough to read them. She read all 12 before she was 14. August had a theory about water that none of his neighbors shared. He believed that most ranchers in that part of Texas were mining the land, taking from the soil and the water table at a rate that exceeded what the country could replenish, and that the bill for this mining would come due eventually, not in his lifetime maybe, but certainly in his children's. He ran fewer cattle than his acreage could support in a wet year, which his neighbors considered waste. He left strips of native grass along his fence lines unplowed, which his neighbors considered laziness. He let the playa lakes on his property fill and drain on their own schedule, without trying to pump them for irrigation, which his neighbors considered foolishness. He also, in the dry years of 1934 and 1936, was the only farmer in his section who did not haul water from town for his livestock. His stock tanks held. Loretta had stayed in Coleman County through high school, and then had gone to work in Abilene for 2 years as a bookkeeper for a feed company, where she had met Paul Gaines at a dance in 1950. Paul was from Throckmorton County, solid and steady and genuinely kind, and he had asked her to dance 3 times in one evening, which she considered a reasonable declaration of intent. They married in 1951 and moved to the Gaines family ranch, which Paul inherited from his father in 1955. She had brought 2 things from her father's place to her marriage. One was a preference for undergrazing rather than overgrazing, which Paul had accepted because it produced good results even when he could not fully explain why. The other was August Prather's habit of watching water, knowing where it ran, where it pooled, where it disappeared into the ground, and where it sheeted off caliche and ran into the draws. She had walked every foot of the Gaines ranch in her first 2 years there, and made a map in her head of where the rain went when it fell. She knew before she ever spoke to a hydrologist which parts of that 960 acres shed water and which parts soaked it in, and she knew that the proportion was badly out of balance. The problem with the Ogallala, which Loretta had understood since 1961 and which most of Throckmorton County would not understand until roughly 1978, was that it did not refill on any schedule a rancher could plan around. It was ancient water, fossil water, deposited 10,000 years ago by a climate that no longer existed, and pumping it at the rate West Texas was pumping. It was not withdrawing from a savings account. It was burning the furniture. There was no interest accumulating. There was only the furniture, less of it every year, and the day when the last of it was gone. Her father had understood this kind of debt, even without knowing the Ogallala's specific geology. He had understood it the way a man understands compound interest, not by formula, but by watching what happens to other men who borrow more than they can repay. Loretta had inherited that understanding the way she had inherited his composition books, carefully with both hands. The catchment basins were the first part. She built 14 of them over 3 years, positioned at the natural collection points her map had told her about, each one designed to hold standing water for 60 to 90 days after a rain rather than the 2 to 3 weeks a conventional stock tank managed in that climate. She graded the approaches, so that as much of the surrounding caliche surface as possible drained into each basin. She planted native grasses on the earthen berms to reduce evaporation from wind. She put float boughs on the two largest basins and ran pipe to stock water troughs, which meant her cattle could drink from collected rainwater during wet months without touching the well. The second part came in 1971, and this was the part that confused people even more than the basins had. She stopped irrigating. Not all at once, not the whole hayfield, but she reduced her irrigated acreage by half in the spring of 1971 and by half again in 1972, replacing the lost production with native hay from pastures she had been resting and managing under a rotation her father would have recognized. The hay yields were lower than irrigated production. The inputs were nothing. No pump hours, no electricity, no drawdown on the well. She was producing less hay in pounds, but spending nothing to produce it, and what she was not spending was water she could not afford to spend. Her hired man, a lean, weathered Texan named Coy Luttrell, who had been working that land since before Paul died, watched these changes with the patience of a man who had seen owners do stranger things. Coy was 61 years old and had worked cattle in Throckmorton County since 1931. He had seen the Depression, the war, the drought of the 50s, and 3 cycles of cattle prices that had driven better operators than the Gaines off their land. He was not given to opinions that he had not been asked for, but one evening in June of 1972, leaning against the corral fence after they had moved the cattle to the north pasture, he said what he was thinking. "Mrs. Gaines," he said, "Coy, you know you are going to have a hay shortfall this winter if we get a dry fall?" "I know." He was quiet for a moment. The way Coy was quiet was the way a deep well is quiet, not empty, just held. "Your daddy raised you to watch water," she finally said, without him asking anything more. "Yes, ma'am." "What do you see when you look at the Harrington place?" He thought about it. Harrington was 3 miles north, 640 acres, good grass once, running thin now, well drilled to 460 feet the previous spring. "I see a man spending money he's going to run out of," Coy said. "That's what I see too." He was quiet again. "I'm not going to run out of money. I don't spend," Loretta said. Coy nodded slowly. He did not say anything else that evening. He had grown up in a family where common sense was considered a private possession, not something you displayed. But he thought about what she had said for a long time afterward, and somewhere in the thinking he began to see the basins and the dried-up hayfield in a different way, not as deficits, as positions. In 1973, Loretta sold 18 cows, not because she needed the money, though the money was useful, but because she had done the math on her water budget and concluded that 122 cows was the number her ranch could support without the well running more than 4 hours a day, using the catchment basins for supplemental watering in the wet months. She was reducing her dependence on the Ogallala, one animal at a time, the way her father had reduced his dependence on borrowed money one season at a time, without announcing it, without drama, as if it were simply the obvious thing to do. Dewey Sutton heard she had sold cattle. He stopped by one afternoon in the fall. "Heard you cut your herd," he said. "By 18 head, she said. "On purpose?" She looked at him steadily. It was not a cruel look. It was the look of a woman who had answered that question too many times. "Everything I have done on this place since 1968 has been on purpose, Dewey." He drove home and told his wife he did not understand Loretta Gaines and had given up trying. His wife said that was probably the right decision. The years between 1973 and 1979 were not dramatic years on the Gaines ranch. They were the kind of years that look like nothing from the outside and look like everything from the inside. Loretta expanded the catchment system twice, adding 4 more basins on the South Range and regrading 2 of the original ones that had silted in faster than she had expected. She continued her rotation program, resting pastures longer than her neighbors rested theirs, accepting lower short-term production for what she could feel happening under her boots, grass that was thicker, root systems that were deeper, soil that absorbed rain rather than shedding it. She kept her herd at 120, refused to expand even in the wet years when her neighbors were adding cows and congratulating themselves, and deposited the difference against the banknote that was long since paid and the future she knew was coming. Coy Luttrell learned to think about water the way she did, not because she explained it to him. She rarely explained anything, but because he was smart enough and had worked that land long enough to see what was happening to it. By 1975, he was managing the basin maintenance and the rotation schedule largely on his own, making decisions about where to graze and when to rest with a judgment that had been formed by 40 years of watching West Texas grass and sharpened by 6 years of watching Loretta Gaines do things nobody else was doing. He had stopped thinking of the basins as strange by 1974. He had started thinking of them as obvious by 1976. Now let me tell you about the summer of 1980, because this is where 12 years of quiet, unfashionable work met the test that Loretta had known was coming and that most of Throckmorton County had managed not to believe in until it arrived. The drought began slowly, as West Texas droughts almost always do, with a dry winter that nobody called a drought yet, just a dry winter and a thin spring and then a summer that did not break. By July of 1980, the temperature at Haskell had reached 103 degrees on 9 consecutive days. The mesquite was the only thing that looked healthy. The grass had gone to straw by the 3rd week of June. Stock tanks that normally held until September were dry by the 4th of July. The wells began to show strain in August. Not all of them, not all at once, but ranchers who had been pumping from wells that were already running thin started getting air in their lines. Started hearing that particular hollow sound a pump makes when it is pulling from a water table that is no longer where it used to be. 3 wells in the county failed completely before Labor Day. One of them was the Harrington place. The other 2 were operations that had drilled deep in the 70s and believed the problem was solved. By September, hay was trading at $90 a ton when it could be found at all, which was not often. Ranchers were trucking water. The auction barn in Haskell was running extra sales to handle the forced liquidations. Calves that should have sold for 60 cents a pound were bringing 38. Cows that should have sold for $400 were bringing $240. The money that people had borrowed to drill deep in 1974 and 1974 and 1975 and 1976 was still owed to banks that were looking at collateral values they had not planned for. Loretta Gaines did not truck water. She did not sell cattle at distress prices. She did not call the driller. Her well ran, not comfortably. She was watching it, and the level was down, not as far down as it had been going before she reduced her pump hours, but down. She ran it 3 hours in the morning and let it recover through the day, and ran it 2 hours in the evening, and between the well and the catchment basins that had been filling since April's last rain, she kept her cattle watered through August and September without crisis. Her grass was dry. It was as dry as everyone else's grass. But the crowns were alive in a way that her neighbors' pastures were not, because the root systems had been going deeper every year for 12 years into soil that had been managed to hold moisture rather than shed it, and the plant community on her land had more diversity and more resilience than country that had been grazed to the edge of its carrying capacity in the good years and was now beyond that edge in the bad one. In late September, Coy found her standing at the edge of the South Basin, the largest one, which still had 2 feet of water in it. The cattle were gathered at the float valve trough. The sky was pale and hot and empty. "Well," he said. She said nothing for a moment. "My father wrote in his book in the summer of 1934 that the man who had water was the man who had built for water before it was scarce." She was quiet. He wrote that in Coleman County, Texas, in July of 1934, which was a very bad July in Coleman County, Texas. In July of 1934, which was a very bad July in Coleman County, Texas. Coy thought about that. August knew, he said. He understood the system, Loretta said. Not just his farm. The whole system, where the water came from and where it went and what happened when you stopped paying attention to both ends of it. She turned away from the basin and walked back toward the truck. The cattle lifted their heads and watched her go. The Haskell Free Press ran a story in October of 1980 about ranchers in Throckmorton County who had weathered the summer with their operations intact. Loretta was one of 4 they called. The reporter was a young man from Abilene who had never been to a ranch in his life and who asked questions that showed it, but he was earnest, and he wrote it down correctly when she answered. He asked her how she had managed it when her neighbors had not. She told him about the catchment basins. He wrote that down. She told him about the reduced herd. He wrote that down. She told him about the rotation, the rested pastures, the soil management. He wrote a version of that down, simplified enough to print in the Free Press without requiring a hydrology degree to understand. Then he asked the question reporters always ask when they do not quite understand what they are writing about. He asked her when she had gotten the idea. Loretta thought about her father's composition books. She thought about the extension bulletin she had bought in 1967 and read twice a year ever since. She thought about the afternoon she had walked the East Range in the spring of 1963 and seen the water running off the caliche and realized for the first time how much of every rain her land was losing before it could be used. "I didn't get the idea," she said. "I got the problem. The idea was just arithmetic." The reporter thanked her and drove back to Abilene. The county changed slowly after 1980, not immediately and not completely. The men who had lost the most in that drought were, in some cases, not in a position to change because they were no longer in a position to operate at all. But the men who survived and were paying attention came around, as people do when they have been frightened enough. Dewey Sutton built his first catchment basin in the spring of 1981. He drove up Loretta's road in March of that year, which was the first time he had done that since Paul died, and sat at her kitchen table and asked her to explain what she had built and why she had built it, where she had built it, where she had built it. She spent 45 minutes with a piece of paper and a pencil drawing the drainage patterns of his east field. He went home and hired a blade operator that week. Others followed, not everyone. A ranch is not a place where ideas travel fast, particularly ideas that require a man to admit that something he has been doing for 30 years was wrong. But in the 5 years after 1980, 9 ranchers in Throckmorton County built catchment systems of some kind. 3 of them came to Loretta first. The others hired engineers. The engineers, to their credit, mostly built what Loretta had built. Coy Luttrell retired in 1983 at the age of 73. He had worked that land for 22 years under 2 different Gaines, and had never, in all that time, told anyone in Haskell that he thought Loretta was right and they were wrong, because that was not how Coy Luttrell operated. But on the last day he worked, in November, when the winter grass was coming in thin and pale on the north pasture, he said what he had been thinking for several years. They were at the barn. She was mending a fence panel and he was watching her, not because she needed watching, but because he had nowhere else he needed to be. "Mrs. Gaines," he said. She kept working. "I have watched a lot of ranchers in this county make a lot of decisions about water." He paused. Most of them made the same decision, which was to get more of it from the ground and not think about where it was coming from. She said nothing. "You thought about where it was coming from." "I thought about where it was going." He considered that for a long time. "Your father must have been something," he finally said. "He wrote things down," she said. "That was his whole secret. He wrote things down every day for 30 years and then he read what he had written." She set down the fence panel. "That is not a complicated secret. It just takes a long time to be worth anything." Coy nodded. He put his hat on and went to get his truck. Loretta ran the ranch until 2001, when she handed the operation to her son Thomas, who had grown up on the place and knew every basin and every fence line the way she had known her father's composition books. Thomas added 3 more basins in his first year and cross-referenced the rainfall records Loretta had kept since 1968 with a computerized soil moisture monitor that his daughter had given him for Christmas, and notating the old data with new instruments the way each generation adds its tools to what it inherits. The well that had been dropping 8 inches a year in 1958 dropped 3.5 inches a year under Loretta's management, and under Thomas, it dropped 2. It has not failed. The water table on the Gaines property, measured every spring against the county average, has been higher than the surrounding land for 20 years. Not dramatically, enough to matter. In 2002, the Texas section of the American Society of Agricultural Engineers gave Loretta a citation at their annual meeting in San Antonio for her work in low-technology water harvesting in semi-arid rangelands. She was 73 years old and had never attended an engineering meeting in her life. Thomas drove her down. She had prepared nothing to say. When the man at the podium finished reading the citation and handed her the plaque, she stood at the microphone for a moment and looked at the room, which was full of engineers holding notebooks and people who had spent their careers building large water projects with large equipment and large budgets. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "I am not an engineer. I never took a hydrology course. I built dirt basins with a borrowed blade, and I planted grass on the berms, and I stopped running my pump more than I had to. She paused. My father kept a composition book, 12 of them. He wrote down where the rain went every time it rained. That is the whole technical basis for everything I built. She paused again. People in my county thought I was wasting my time with mud holes because they believed the solution to a water problem was to find more water underground. I thought the solution was to waste less of the water that was falling out of the sky for free. She looked down at the plaque. Those were different theories. One of them requires a drill rig. The other requires a pencil and a notebook and 30 years of paying attention. She stepped back from the microphone. The room was quiet, and then it was not. Dewey Sutton was in the audience. He was 87 years old and had driven up from Haskell with his son because he had seen the notice in the paper and decided it was worth the drive. He had been running a catchment system on his east field for 21 years. It had kept his cattle watered through 2 more droughts since 1980, the dry summer of 1988 and the worse one of 1996. And he had never once told another farmer at the coffee shop in Haskell that it was the basins that had saved him, because he understood by then that some lessons only land when a man has already been frightened enough to receive them. After the ceremony, Dewey found her in the hallway. "Loretta," he said. She turned and looked at him. He was quiet for a moment. 87 years of West Texas had reduced him to his essentials, which in Dewey Sutton's case were considerable. "I stood at your fence in 1968, he said, "and I watched you build something I did not understand." "I know. I went home and told my wife you had run out of real options." She smiled, not unkindly. "I had run out of the option that cost money," she said. "I still had the option that cost time." He laughed. It was the laugh of a man who has lived long enough to find his own errors genuinely funny. He put his hat in both hands and looked at it. "Your daddy raised you right," he said. "He wrote things down," she said. "That was all he did. He wrote things down and he read them back and then he made sure I read them too. The rest was just arithmetic." Dewey nodded. He put his hat back on and shook her hand and walked back to his son, who was waiting by the door with the truck keys. What Loretta Gaines built on 960 acres of semi-arid Texas between 1968 and 2001 was not complicated. It was 14 earthen basins, a managed rotation, a reduced herd, and a well that she used less than her neighbors used theirs. She did not invent rainwater harvesting. Aboriginal Australians have been doing it for 40,000 years. Farmers in the Negev desert had been doing it since before the time of Christ. The Romans had done it. The Anasazi had done it in the very American Southwest that Loretta was working, leaving behind check dams and terraced fields that hydrologists still study today. The knowledge had been there. It had been there the whole time. What it needed was a woman who had read her father's notebooks and understood that a drought is not a surprise. It is an appointment, and the difference between ranchers who kept that appointment, with their operations intact, and ranchers who did not had been made long before the appointment arrived, in ordinary years, with a blade and a pencil, and the willingness to spend time instead of money on a problem that everybody else was paying a driller to postpone. $11.40. A rain gauge, a soil auger, and a bulletin nobody wanted. The well nobody fixed on the ranch of the widow. Nobody understood until 2 dry summers and a row of earthen basins full of rainwater told Throckmorton County everything it should have already known. Some people see a problem and reach for the expensive solution. Loretta Gaines saw the same problem and asked where the rain was going. That question, asked in 1963 and answered slowly over 30 years, was worth more than every drill rig in West Texas. I keep thinking about that rain gauge. $11.40. That's where it started. Not with a big idea or a bold announcement, but with a cheap tool and a question nobody else in Throckmorton County was asking. What I notice about Loretta isn't the basins she built or the wells she didn't drill. What I notice is the kind of person she had to be before any of that was possible. Her father, August, kept 12 composition books, 12 years of daily entries about rain and grass and where the water went. He didn't do that because someone told him to. He did it because he understood that honest observation, just seeing what is actually there, not what you hope is there, is a form of integrity. You can't keep a record like that and lie to yourself at the same time. That's what I mean when I think about the moral core of what Loretta inherited. It wasn't a philosophy. It was a habit of honesty about what the land was telling her. even when the honest answer was inconvenient and expensive and made the neighbors think she'd lost her mind. And then there's the matter of understanding. Loretta read. She read extension bulletins nobody asked for. She read about the Ogallala in 1961, 15 years before most people in her county would admit there was a problem. She understood the difference between a savings account and burning the furniture, and she understood it not because she had a degree in hydrology, but because she had trained herself to follow a thing to its logical end. That kind of thinking, tracing a problem back to its actual cause instead of treating the symptom, is rarer than it sounds. Most people in 1968 saw a dropping water table and thought, drill deeper. Loretta saw a dropping water table and thought, where is the rain going before it gets to the table? Same information, different quality of reasoning. The difference between those two questions was, ultimately, the difference between operations that survived 1980 and operations that didn't. But none of it would have mattered without the third thing, which is the one I find hardest to write about. Loretta built her first catchment basin in 1968. The drought that proved her right came in 1980. That is 12 years of being the woman building mud holes while her neighbors drilled deeper and expanded their herds and didn't ask questions. 12 years of Dewey Sutton standing at the fence with that look on his face. 12 years of operating on a theory that had not yet been tested by the one event that would make it obvious. That takes something I don't have a single clean word for. A combination of patience and backbone, and the quiet refusal to need other people's approval before you trust what you know. She didn't build the basins to prove a point. She built them because the arithmetic was clear, and the arithmetic didn't care whether anyone in Haskell believed her. What I take from Loretta's story isn't a lesson about water management. It's something more basic than that. Results don't precede decisions. The ranch that survived 1980 was built in the ordinary years. In 1968, in 1971, in 1973, in years when nothing dramatic was happening and it would have been easy to do what everyone else was doing. The cause came first. The effect came 12 years later. That sequence is not reversible, and it is not negotiable. You don't get to start building the basins in July of 1980 when the well is making that hollow sound. Loretta's father wrote things down. Loretta read what he wrote and added to it. Thomas read what she wrote and added instruments. 4 generations, each one doing the honest, careful, patient work before the crisis arrived. That's the whole story. That's also the whole instruction.